The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand palace courtyard as Marcus Bennett stood at his post. His red uniform was pressed to perfection, gold buttons gleaming under the early light. For 5 years he had served as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace, and in all that time, he had never broken his famous stillness. Tourists would come from all corners of the world just to try and make him smile, laugh, or even blink. Children would make funny faces. Adults would tell jokes. Some would even try to dance in front of him. But Marcus remained still as a statue, eyes fixed forward, breathing so subtle that people often wondered if he was even real. Marcus took pride in his work. His father had been a guard before him, and his grandfather before that. It was more than just a job to the Bennett family. It was honor, tradition, and duty rolled into one. Every morning Marcus would wake up at 5, exercise for an hour, eat a simple breakfast, and mentally prepare himself for the day ahead. His wife Sarah often joked that he practiced his serious face in the bathroom mirror. She was not entirely wrong. On this particular Tuesday morning, everything seemed normal. The sky was clear, the tourists were already gathering behind the metal barriers, and Marcus's fellow guards were taking their positions. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours his life would change forever. He had no clue that a simple afternoon would turn into a viral moment seen by millions around the world. Around noon, the palace grounds became unusually busy. Security personnel were moving with more urgency than usual. Radios crackled with coded messages. Marcus noticed but remained focused on his duty. He had been trained to stay alert while appearing completely detached from his surroundings. It was an art form that took years to master. What Marcus did not know was that the Metropolitan Police had received intelligence about a potential security threat near the palace. A suspect had been spotted in the area, and a SWAT team was being deployed as a precautionary measure. The information was vague and the threat level was unclear, but the authorities were taking no chances. In today's world, even the smallest hint of danger required a massive response. The SWAT team arrived in unmarked vehicles, their presence meant to be discreet. They wore full tactical gear, faces covered, weapons ready. Their job was to sweep the perimeter and ensure that no genuine threat existed. The team leader, Officer James Crawford, was a veteran with 15 years of experience. He had handled hundreds of operations from hostage situations to terrorist threats. He was calm, professional, and methodical in his approach. As the SWAT team spread out across the area, tourists began to notice. Some thought it was part of a training exercise. Others grabbed their phones, ready to capture whatever was about to happen. The atmosphere shifted from casual sightseeing to tense anticipation. Parents pulled their children closer. Tour guides stopped their speeches mid-sentence. Marcus remained at his post, unmoving. He could see the tactical team in his peripheral vision, but his training told him to stay focused. He was a symbol, a living representation of British tradition and discipline. No matter what happened around him, he would not break character. That was the unspoken rule that every royal guard lived by. Officer Crawford and his team moved through the crowd efficiently. They checked bags, scanned faces, and communicated through hand signals. Everything was proceeding according to protocol until one of the younger officers spotted something suspicious. A backpack had been left unattended near one of the barriers, just a few meters from where Marcus stood. The officer immediately radioed it in. Crawford rushed over, his team forming a protective circle around the suspicious item. The crowd was ordered to move back, but in the chaos and confusion, not everyone heard the instruction clearly. Some people pushed forward, trying to get a better view. Others ran in the opposite direction, fearing the worst. In the middle of this confusion, Crawford made a split-second decision. He needed to create a wider perimeter quickly. He turned and, without thinking, pushed against what he thought was a tourist standing too close to the restricted zone. But it was not a tourist. It was Marcus. The shove was not gentle. Crawford was operating on pure instinct, his mind focused entirely on the potential threat. Marcus stumbled backward, his tall bearskin hat tilting to one side. For the first time in 5 years of service, he broke his stance. His carefully maintained composure shattered in an instant. The crowd gasped collectively. Phones were raised higher. Everyone was recording. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, though not quite in the way they had imagined. A royal guard had been pushed by a SWAT officer. The unthinkable had just happened. Marcus caught himself before falling completely. His training kicked in, and he straightened his uniform with practiced efficiency. But his face, usually a mask of neutral expression, now showed something else. It was not anger or embarrassment. It was something deeper, more complex. It was the look of a man whose entire identity had just been challenged in front of hundreds of witnesses. Crawford immediately realized his mistake. He turned to face Marcus, and their eyes met for just a brief second. In that moment, both men understood the gravity of what had just occurred. This was not just a physical push. It was a collision of two different worlds, two different duties, two different codes of honor. The suspicious backpack turned out to be harmless, just a forgotten tourist bag containing nothing more than snacks and a camera. But the damage was already done. The incident had been captured from multiple angles by dozens of smartphones. Within minutes, the videos would be uploaded to social media. Within hours, they would be seen by millions. And within days, both Marcus and Crawford would find themselves at the center of a story that neither of them could have predicted. As the SWAT team cleared the area and began to withdraw, Marcus returned to his position. He adjusted his bearskin hat, straightened his rifle, and resumed his stance. But something had changed. The tourists around him were no longer trying to make him smile. They were quiet, watching him with a new kind of respect mixed with curiosity. They had just witnessed something rare, a glimpse behind the ceremonial mask that royal guards wore every day. Marcus stood there for the remaining 2 hours of his shift. Not moving, not speaking, but his mind was racing. He thought about his father, his grandfather, and the legacy they had passed down to him. He wondered if he had somehow failed that legacy by breaking his stance, even though it had not been his choice. He wondered what Sarah would say when she saw the videos that were surely already spreading across the internet. Marcus arrived home that evening with heavy shoulders and an even heavier heart. His shift had ended at 4 in the afternoon, but he had been asked to stay behind for a brief meeting with his commanding officer. The discussion had been short and surprisingly understanding. Colonel Patterson had seen the videos already. Half the world had seen them by then. The incident was trending on every social media platform imaginable. Sarah was waiting for him at the door of their small flat in South London. She had seen the videos too. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop with messages from friends and family. Some were concerned, others were curious, and a few were even congratulatory, as if Marcus had done something intentionally brave. But Sarah knew her husband better than anyone. She could see past the stoic expression he still wore. She could see the turmoil behind his eyes. They sat together at the kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold between them. Marcus did not speak at first. He just stared at his hands. These same hands that had held his rifle with perfect steadiness for 5 years. These hands that had never trembled even when tourists shouted or cameras flashed inches from his face. Now they seemed foreign to him, as if they belonged to someone else. Sarah reached across the table and covered his hands with her own. She did not ask if he was okay because she already knew the answer. Instead, she simply said what he needed to hear most. She told him she was proud of him, not because he had been pushed or because he had become an internet sensation. She was proud because even in that moment of chaos, he had maintained his dignity. He had not lashed out. He had not abandoned his post. He had simply steadied himself and carried on. While Marcus sat in his quiet kitchen trying to process everything, Officer James Crawford was having a very different evening. He was sitting in a police station conference room, surrounded by his superiors and a public relations team. The Metropolitan Police were in damage control mode. Videos of a SWAT officer pushing a ceremonial guard were not good for public image, especially when that guard represented one of the most iconic symbols of British culture. Crawford had already given his statement multiple times. He had explained the suspicious backpack, the urgent need to establish a perimeter, and the split-second decision that had led to the push. His intentions had been good. His actions had been based on training and protocol, but intentions did not matter much in the court of public opinion, and the court of public opinion was currently in session across every corner of the internet. The comments on the viral videos were divided. Some people defended Crawford, understanding that he was just doing his job in what he believed was a dangerous situation. Others criticized him harshly, saying he should have been more aware of his surroundings and more respectful of the Royal Guard. Then there were those who turned it into jokes and memes because that is what the internet does best. Within hours, edited versions of the video appeared with dramatic music, slow-motion effects, and humorous captions. Marcus's phone buzzed constantly through the night. Messages from old friends he had not spoken to in years. Interview requests from news outlets. Even a few brand partnership offers from companies that wanted to use his newfound fame to sell products. It was overwhelming and surreal. Just this morning he had been anonymous, one guard among many. Now his face was everywhere, frozen in that moment of surprise, that fraction of a second when his perfect composure had been interrupted. Sleep did not come easy that night for either man. Marcus lay awake replaying the incident in his mind, analyzing every detail, wondering what he could have done differently even though there was nothing he could have changed. Crawford lay awake too, but his thoughts were different. He kept thinking about the look in Marcus's eyes during that brief moment when they had made eye contact. There had been no anger there, no accusation, just understanding, and somehow that made Crawford feel even worse. The next morning brought a new wave of media attention. The story had evolved from a simple viral video into a full-blown news cycle topic. Television programs debated whether the SWAT team had overreacted. Newspapers ran headlines about tradition versus modern security. Radio hosts took calls from listeners who all had strong opinions about what should happen next. Some demanded that Crawford be disciplined. Others insisted that Marcus deserved an apology. Everyone had something to say, but the two men at the center of it all remained silent. Marcus reported for duty as scheduled. His commanding officer had given him the option to take a few days off, but Marcus had declined. Taking time off felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that something had truly been damaged. So he put on his uniform, adjusted his bearskin hat and headed to the palace just as he had done every day for the past 5 years. The crowd that morning was 3 times larger than usual. News vans were parked nearby. Reporters stood behind the barriers with their cameramen, all waiting to see if the now famous guard would show up. When Marcus took his position, a ripple of excitement went through the gathered tourists. Cameras clicked and flashed. People pointed and whispered. But Marcus did what he always did. He became still, eyes forward, breathing controlled, a living statue once again. Crawford did not go to work that day. He had been placed on temporary administrative leave while the incident was being reviewed. It was standard procedure, his captain had assured him, not a punishment. But it felt like punishment. He sat in his apartment, curtains drawn, avoiding social media but unable to stop thinking about the fallout from his actions. He had been a police officer for 15 years. He had made countless difficult decisions in high-pressure situations. He had saved lives. And yet this one moment, this one unintentional push had become the thing he would be remembered for. Around midday, Crawford made a decision. He needed to see Marcus, not because the police department told him to, and not because any public relations team suggested it. He needed to see Marcus because it was the right thing to do. He needed to apologize face to face, human to human, stripped of uniforms and titles and the roles they played. Finding out when Marcus would be off duty was not difficult. The guard rotation schedules were somewhat public knowledge, especially now that Marcus had become recognizable. Crawford learned that Marcus's shift would end at 4 in the afternoon, so he waited near the palace, keeping his distance from the crowds and the reporters, just another person in civilian clothes among thousands of tourists. When Marcus finally came out of the palace through a side entrance, still in uniform, Crawford approached carefully. For a moment he thought Marcus might walk right past him, pretending not to see him. After all, Crawford had not exactly earned the right to this man's attention. But Marcus stopped. He looked at Crawford directly, really looked at him, and there was that same expression from yesterday. Understanding without anger. Acknowledgement without accusation. Crawford opened his mouth to speak, to deliver the apology he had been rehearsing all morning. But Marcus raised a hand gently, stopping him. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was genuine. He told Crawford that he understood. He said he knew Crawford had been doing his job, trying to protect people, operating in a moment of perceived danger. He said there was nothing to forgive because there had been no malice, only duty meeting duty in an unfortunate way. Crawford felt something release in his chest, a tension he had been carrying since yesterday. But Marcus was not finished speaking. He said something else. Something that would stick with Crawford for the rest of his life. He said that both of them were guardians in their own way, both dedicated to protecting others. and that sometimes guardians collide not because they are enemies, but because they are both trying to do right in a complicated world. The conversation between Marcus and Crawford lasted nearly an hour. They stood on a quiet street corner away from the palace crowds, two men in different uniforms finding common ground in unexpected circumstances. Crawford learned that Marcus came from a military family, that his decision to become a royal guard had been about honoring tradition, but also about finding purpose. Marcus learned that Crawford had joined the police force after losing a close friend in a terrorist attack, that every operation he conducted was driven by a deep need to prevent others from experiencing that same loss. As they talked, something remarkable happened. The incident that had brought them together began to fade in importance. It became just the starting point of a conversation that was really about something much bigger. They talked about duty, sacrifice, and the weight of responsibility. They talked about the moments when training takes over and you act on instinct, and the moments afterward when you question whether your instincts were right. They talked about being seen by millions but truly understood by very few. Before they parted ways, Crawford asked Marcus if he would be willing to meet again. Not for publicity or to satisfy anyone's expectations, but simply because their conversation had meant something real. Marcus agreed. They exchanged phone numbers, and just like that, an unlikely friendship began to form between a royal guard and a SWAT officer who had literally collided into each other's lives. Meanwhile, the media coverage continued to evolve. News outlets that had initially sensationalized the incident now began to dig deeper. Reporters interviewed former royal guards about the physical and mental demands of their job. They spoke with police officers about split-second decision-making in high-stress situations. The story was becoming less about conflict and more about context. People were beginning to understand that what had looked like a simple confrontation was actually a complex intersection of two demanding professions. Sarah noticed the change in Marcus over the following days. He seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by what had happened. The incident had initially felt like a public humiliation, but it was transforming into something else. Letters began arriving at the palace addressed to Marcus. Some were from military veterans thanking him for his service. Others were from young people who said they had been inspired by how he had handled himself. A few were from security professionals expressing solidarity and respect for both him and Crawford. Crawford was experiencing something similar. His administrative leave was coming to an end, and his superiors had concluded that he had acted appropriately given the information available at the time. The backpack incident had been a false alarm, but there had been no way to know that in the moment. The review board understood that hesitation in such situations could cost lives. They commended him for his quick response while also using the incident as a teaching moment about spatial awareness, even in crisis situations. One evening, Marcus and Crawford met again, this time at a small pub away from central London where they could talk without being recognized or interrupted. Over pints of beer, they shared stories that most people never get to hear. Marcus talked about the tourists who had actually made him laugh internally, even though his face never showed it. He described the children who would draw pictures for him and slide them under the barrier, the elderly veterans who would salute him with tears in their eyes, the young couples who would pose for engagement photos with him standing stoically in the background. Crawford shared stories from his years in tactical operations. He talked about the calls that had ended well and the ones that still haunted him. He described the adrenaline surge that comes with breaching a door not knowing what waits on the other side, and the strange calm that settles over you afterward. He explained how every officer on his team had their own way of processing stress, their own rituals and routines to stay mentally strong. As they talked, other pub patrons occasionally recognized them. Some asked for photos, others simply nodded respectfully. One old man bought them a round of drinks and said he was glad to see them getting along. The public sentiment had shifted dramatically in just a week. What had started as a viral scandal had become a story about reconciliation and mutual respect. The friendship between Marcus and Crawford grew stronger with each meeting. They discovered they had more in common than their initial encounter might have suggested. Both were devoted to their families. Both struggled with the challenge of leaving work stress at the door when they came home. Both understood what it meant to serve in roles where you are simultaneously visible and invisible, where people see your uniform but rarely see the person inside it. Sarah and Crawford's wife, Linda, eventually met as well, The four of them had dinner together one Saturday evening, and what could have been awkward turned out to be wonderful. Linda and Sarah immediately connected over the shared experience of being married to men in demanding, sometimes dangerous professions. They talked about the sleepless nights and the constant worry, but also about the pride they felt watching their husbands dedicate themselves to something larger than personal comfort. During that dinner, Crawford brought up an idea he had been thinking about. He suggested that perhaps something good could come from their viral moment. Perhaps they could use the attention to raise awareness about the mental health challenges faced by people in their professions. Royal Guards dealing with the strain of maintaining absolute composure for hours every day. Police officers carrying the weight of traumatic incidents. Military personnel transitioning back to civilian life. These were important issues that often got overlooked. Marcus was intrigued by the idea. He had never thought of himself as an advocate or public speaker. He was just a guard, someone who stood still and followed orders. But Crawford pointed out that millions of people now knew his face. They had watched him stumble and recover. They had seen him remain dignified in a difficult moment. He had a platform whether he wanted it or not. The question was whether he would use it. Over the next few weeks, Marcus and Crawford worked with a charity organization that supported veterans and first responders. They agreed to participate in a public awareness campaign about mental health and the importance of checking in on those who serve in high-stress roles. The campaign would feature their story, but not in a sensational way. Instead, it would focus on the humanity behind the uniforms, the shared struggles, and the power of understanding and forgiveness. The campaign launch was scheduled for a month after the initial incident. Media outlets that had once sensationalized the push were now interested in covering this redemptive angle. Interview requests poured in, but Marcus and Crawford were selective. They wanted to work with journalists who would take the issue seriously, who understood that this was not about celebrity, but about shining a light on important challenges. The night before the campaign launch, Marcus stood at his usual post at the palace. The crowds had returned to normal sizes. The reporters had moved on to other stories. Life had in many ways gone back to usual. But Marcus knew he was not the same person who had stood in this exact spot a month ago. The incident with Crawford had changed him, not by breaking him, but by opening him up to possibilities he had never considered. He thought about his father and grandfather, both of whom had served as royal guards. He wondered what they would think of everything that had happened. Would they see it as a failure of discipline? Or would they understand that sometimes the most rigid traditions need to be challenged gently from within? Would they approve of him using his experience to help others? Or would they think he was drawing too much attention to himself? As Marcus stood there contemplating these questions, a young boy approached the barrier with his mother. The boy could not have been more than 6 years old. He looked up at Marcus with wide eyes full of wonder. Then he did something unexpected. He saluted, a small hand raised to his forehead in clumsy imitation of a military gesture. His mother smiled apologetically and tried to lower his hand, but Marcus did something he had never done in 5 years of service. He gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement, so subtle that most people would have missed it. But the boy saw it. His face lit up with pure joy, and he turned to his mother exclaiming that the guard had seen him. The mental health awareness campaign launched on a crisp autumn morning at a community center in London. The venue was deliberately chosen to be modest and accessible rather than grand and intimidating. Marcus and Crawford stood together on a small stage, both in civilian clothes, looking remarkably ordinary without their uniforms. The audience was a mixture of veterans, active service members, first responders, their families, and members of the press who had agreed to cover the event respectfully. Marcus spoke first, his voice steady but softer than people might have expected from someone who stood guard at a royal palace. He talked about the invisible pressures of his job, about standing perfectly still while your mind races, about maintaining composure when your legs ache and your back screams for relief. He described the mental discipline required to ignore provocations, to remain neutral in the face of mockery or admiration. But most importantly, he talked about what happens when that discipline is all you know, when you become so good at hiding what you feel that you sometimes forget how to feel at all. He shared something he had never told anyone except Sarah. There had been days, particularly in his first year as a guard, when the stillness had felt like a prison. Days when he would return home and realize he had not genuinely smiled or laughed in weeks. Days when the mask he wore on duty had started to feel more real than his actual face. He had thought something was wrong with him, that perhaps he was not cut out for the job his father and grandfather had done so effortlessly. It was only through talking with fellow guards and eventually seeking help from a counselor that he learned these feelings were common, valid, and manageable. The room was silent as Marcus spoke. You could see recognition in many faces, that subtle nod that said someone else understands what you have been through. When Marcus finished, there was no applause. It would have felt wrong somehow. Instead, there was a collective exhale as if the room had been holding its breath and could finally release it. Crawford spoke next, and his approach was different but equally powerful. He talked about the adrenaline addiction that can develop in tactical operations, how your body gets used to the surge of chemicals that flood your system during high-stress incidents. He described coming home after a dangerous operation and feeling utterly disconnected from normal life, unable to care about ordinary concerns when hours ago he had been preparing for potential violence. He spoke about the nightmares that sometimes came, the ones where split-second decisions played out differently, where hesitation costs lives, where the innocent become casualties. He also talked specifically about the incident with Marcus. He explained how reviewing the footage afterward had been painful, because he could see how tunnel-visioned he had been in that moment. The suspicious backpack had consumed his entire focus, and everything else had become obstacles to be moved rather than people to be respected. He said that incident had taught him something crucial about maintaining humanity even in crisis, about remembering that everyone around you has their own duty and dignity that deserves consideration, even when you are operating under pressure. Crawford's honesty was striking. Here was a decorated officer with 15 years of experience admitting to mistakes and vulnerabilities. He was not presenting himself as a hero who had everything figured out. He was just a person trying to do difficult work while staying mentally and emotionally healthy. His willingness to be vulnerable gave others permission to acknowledge their own struggles. After their speeches, the event opened up for discussion. Service members and first responders shared their own experiences. A firefighter talked about the guilt that lingered after losing someone in a blaze, even when everything possible had been done. A paramedic described the cumulative trauma of witnessing suffering day after day. A military veteran spoke about the difficulty of transitioning back to civilian life, where the skills that had kept him alive in combat had no practical application and sometimes made normal interactions feel threatening. What made the discussion powerful was the diversity of experiences. A young police officer who had only been on the force for 2 years realized she was not alone in her struggles. A Royal Guard who had served for a decade learned that his coping mechanisms were not signs of weakness but normal responses to abnormal demands. Family members gained insight into what their loved ones were carrying. The conversation created connections that would extend beyond this single event. The media coverage that followed was overwhelmingly positive. News outlets focused on the courage it took for Marcus and Crawford to speak publicly about mental health. Opinion pieces praised their approach to using an unfortunate incident as a launching point for important conversations. Social media, which had once been filled with jokes and debates about the push, now featured people sharing their own stories and thanking Marcus and Crawford for their openness. The charity organization that had partnered with them reported an immediate spike in people reaching out for support. Veterans who had been silently struggling called the helpline. First responders who had been considering leaving their professions found resources to help them cope. Family members learned about support groups where they could connect with others who understood the unique challenges of loving someone in a high-stress service role. But perhaps the most meaningful impact happened in smaller, more personal ways. Royal Guards at Buckingham Palace began having informal conversations about the pressures they faced. Some had served for years without ever acknowledging to each other how difficult the stillness could be. Now there was an opening, a permission to be honest. One guard confessed that he had started experiencing panic attacks during his shifts, but had been too afraid to report them for fear of being seen as weak. With Marcus's story as context, he was able to seek help without shame. Similarly, officers in Crawford's unit started talking more openly about difficult operations and their emotional aftermath. The culture had always been to tough it out, to drink a beer and move on. But Crawford's willingness to admit he still thought about past incidents, still questioned his decisions, created space for others to do the same. One of the younger officers revealed that he had been having nightmares since a hostage situation months earlier. His teammates, instead of dismissing it, shared that they had experienced similar things and offered support. Marcus and Crawford continued to meet regularly, their friendship deepening beyond the incident that had brought them together. They discovered they both enjoyed hiking, so they started taking weekend trips to the countryside, walking through forests and up hills, talking about everything and nothing. These hikes became therapy sessions of a sort, places where they could process their experiences away from the demands of their jobs. During one of these hikes, Crawford asked Marcus if he had any regrets about speaking publicly. Marcus thought about it for a long moment before answering. He said that for years he had defined himself entirely by his ability to be still, to be unshakable. The incident with Crawford had shaken him literally and figuratively, and his first instinct had been to see that as failure. But through everything that followed, he had learned that being shaken does not mean being broken. Sometimes being shaken just means you are human, and being human is not a flaw in duty, it is the foundation of meaningful duty. Crawford shared his own reflection. He said that the incident had forced him to slow down and question his approach to crisis response. He had always been praised for his decisiveness, his ability to act quickly under pressure. But quickness without awareness could cause its own kind of harm. He had learned to build in micro moments of assessment, brief pauses to register the full situation before acting. It was making him a better officer, more effective because he was more thoughtful. As autumn turned to winter, Marcus and Crawford were invited to speak at police academies and military training programs. Their message was consistent wherever they went. They talked about the importance of mental resilience, about recognizing when you need help, about the strength it takes to be vulnerable. But they also emphasized something else, something that resonated deeply with their audiences. They talked about how duty and humanity are not opposites. You can be disciplined and still acknowledge your feelings. You can be strong and still ask for support. You can serve with excellence while also honoring your own mental and emotional needs. 6 months after the incident, Marcus received a letter that would change his perspective even further. It came from a young man named Thomas who lived in Manchester. Thomas wrote that he had been planning to end his life on the day the video of Marcus being pushed went viral. He had been a soldier who had returned from deployment with severe post-traumatic stress. He felt broken, useless, unable to function in the normal world. He had convinced himself that everyone would be better off without him, but then he saw the video, and more importantly, he saw what happened afterward. He watched Marcus and Crawford speak at the campaign launch. He heard them talk about struggling, about feeling disconnected, about the weight of duty. For the first time in months, Thomas felt understood. If a decorated Royal Guard and an experienced SWAT officer could admit they struggled, then maybe his own struggles did not make him weak or damaged beyond repair. That realization had been enough to make him reach out for help. He was now in therapy, reconnecting with his family and slowly rebuilding his life. He wanted Marcus to know that his willingness to be vulnerable had literally saved a life. Marcus read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Sarah found him at the kitchen table, the letter clutched in his hands, shoulders shaking with emotion. She held him as he cried, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude and purpose. He had spent 5 years standing perfectly still, being a symbol representing tradition and discipline. But this letter showed him that speaking, moving, being imperfect and human had reached someone in a way that perfect stillness never could. He shared the letter with Crawford during their next meeting. Crawford was equally moved, and he revealed that he had received similar messages. One letter was from a police officer who had been on the verge of leaving the force because he could not handle the stress anymore. Another was from a firefighter who had been drinking heavily to cope with the things he had seen. Both credited the campaign and the honest conversations it had sparked with helping them find better ways forward. The ripple effects of one viral moment were spreading further than either Marcus or Crawford had imagined possible. The charity organization asked them to become official ambassadors, a role that would involve more public speaking, more advocacy work, and more visibility. Both men were hesitant at first. Marcus still valued his privacy and the quiet dignity of his guard duties. Crawford worried about being seen as someone who had turned a mistake into personal gain. But after discussing it with their wives and reflecting on letters like Thomas's, they agreed. The work was too important to let discomfort hold them back. Their roles as ambassadors took them to places they had never expected to go. They spoke at a conference in Scotland about organizational culture and mental health. They participated in a panel discussion in Wales about the long-term effects of occupational stress. They visited military bases where young recruits were being trained, talking to them about building mental resilience alongside physical strength. They met with government officials to advocate for better mental health resources for service members and first responders. Through all of this, both men continued their regular jobs. Marcus still stood guard at the palace, still maintained his famous stillness, still wore his red uniform with gold buttons and towering bearskin hat. But now tourists who recognized him saw something more than just a ceremonial figure. They saw a person who had turned a difficult moment into an opportunity to help others. Some would quietly say thank you as they passed. Others would simply give a respectful nod. The dynamic had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Crawford returned to active duty with the SWAT team, but his approach had evolved. He was still decisive and effective, but now he incorporated those micro moments of awareness he had talked about. His team noticed the change and appreciated it. Operations felt more measured, more thoughtful without losing any of their efficiency. Crawford also started leading informal discussions with his team about mental health, creating a space where officers could talk about difficult operations and their emotional impact. The friendship between Marcus and Crawford became something of a legend in both their professional communities. Royal Guards would joke that if Marcus could forgive being shoved by a SWAT officer, they could surely forgive the minor annoyances of their own daily duties. Police officers would reference the story as an example of how accountability and humility could turn mistakes into learning opportunities. The incident had become a teaching moment, a case study in how to handle conflict, acknowledge fault, and move forward with grace. 1 year after the incident, the charity organization held an anniversary event. It was much larger than the original campaign launch, with hundreds of attendees including service members, first responders, mental health professionals, and families. Marcus and Crawford were asked to speak again, to reflect on the year that had passed and the impact the campaign had made. Marcus talked about the evolution of his understanding of strength. He said that for most of his life he had equated strength with stoicism, with the ability to endure without showing weakness. But this year had taught him that real strength includes the courage to be vulnerable, to admit when you are struggling, to ask for help. He said that standing still for hours might look impressive, but having the courage to speak honestly about your inner battles was far more difficult and far more valuable. Crawford spoke about the concept of service beyond protocol. He explained that as a SWAT officer, he had always focused on following procedures and completing missions. But the incident with Marcus had shown him that true service means seeing the humanity in every situation, considering impact beyond immediate objectives. He said that the best officers are not the ones who never make mistakes, but the ones who learn from their mistakes and use those lessons to become better protectors of their communities. The event featured testimonials from people whose lives had been touched by the campaign. Thomas, the young veteran from Manchester, spoke in person about his journey from despair to hope. A police officer talked about finding the courage to seek therapy after hearing Crawford's speech. A wife described how the campaign had helped her understand what her husband experienced as a firefighter and improved their communication. A royal guard explained how the changed culture at the palace had allowed him to be honest about his struggles with anxiety. These testimonials illustrated the campaign's success, not in grand, sweeping changes, but in individual lives touched and redirected. Mental health issues do not disappear overnight, but creating environments where people can acknowledge their struggles without shame makes treatment possible. That was the gift Marcus and Crawford had helped give through their willingness to transform an uncomfortable viral moment into a platform for honest conversation. After the event, Marcus and Crawford sat together in a quiet corner of the venue. They were exhausted but content, the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from doing meaningful work. Crawford mentioned that his daughter, who was 10 years old, had told him she was proud of her father not because he was tough, but because he was honest. Marcus shared that his father, the former royal guard who he had worried would disapprove of his public vulnerability, had actually called to tell him he was doing important work that would help the next generation of guards serve with both discipline and emotional health. They realized that what had started as an accident, a collision of duties in a moment of perceived crisis, had become something neither could have planned or predicted. The viral video that had initially seemed like a humiliating end had actually been a surprising beginning. It had opened doors, created connections, sparked conversations, and ultimately saved lives. Not because the incident itself was special, but because two men had chosen to respond to it with honesty, grace, and a commitment to turning difficulty into purpose. 2 years had passed since that autumn afternoon, when a SWAT officer's hand had collided with a Royal Guard's shoulder. Time had a way of putting things into perspective, and from this distance Marcus could see just how profoundly that moment had altered the trajectory of his life. He still stood guard at Buckingham Palace, but it was no longer his only identity. He had become something more, someone whose stillness had given way to movement, whose silence had evolved into meaningful speech. The mental health initiative that Marcus and Crawford had helped launch had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What began as a single campaign had expanded into a comprehensive support network for service members and first responders across the United Kingdom. The charity had opened 3 dedicated counseling centers, staffed by therapists who specialized in occupational trauma. They had developed training programs that were being incorporated into police academies, military training facilities, and fire departments. The conversation about mental health in these professions had fundamentally shifted. Marcus had been invited to speak at international conferences, sharing the story and its lessons with audiences in other countries. He traveled to Canada, Australia, and several European nations, each time amazed by how universal the struggles were. A Royal Guard in Sweden faced the same psychological pressures as Marcus did in London. A police officer in Toronto carried the same weight as Crawford did. The uniforms and protocols might differ, but the human experience underneath was remarkably similar. During one of these international trips, Marcus met a young woman named Elena who worked as a paramedic in Spain. She told him that she had been inspired by his story to start a support group for emergency medical personnel in her city. Before the group, she had felt isolated in her trauma, believing that her inability to simply move on from difficult calls meant she was not suited for her job. The support group had shown her that processing trauma was not a sign of weakness, but a necessary part of sustainable service. She hugged Marcus when they met, tears in her eyes, thanking him for helping her understand that she was not alone. Crawford's life had transformed as well. He had been promoted to a leadership position within the Metropolitan Police, specifically tasked with developing better protocols for officer mental health and wellness. His first-hand experience, combined with the credibility he had earned through honest advocacy, made him uniquely qualified for the role. He implemented mandatory mental health check-ins after critical incidents, not as punitive measures but as standard care. He created peer support networks where experienced officers could help newer ones navigate the emotional challenges of the job. One of Crawford's proudest achievements was establishing a program that paired retiring officers with those still on active duty. The wisdom and perspective of veterans who had successfully navigated decades in the force proved invaluable for younger officers struggling with the demands of the job. The program reduced burnout rates and improved job satisfaction significantly. Crawford knew that policy changes alone would not fix everything, but they could create structures that made it easier for people to get the help they needed. Marcus and Crawford still met regularly, though their schedules had become increasingly demanding. Their friendship had deepened into something like brotherhood. They knew each other's families well now. They had celebrated birthdays and holidays together. They had supported each other through difficult times, including when Crawford's father passed away and when Marcus dealt with a health scare that temporarily took him off guard duty. The bond forged in that viral moment had become one of the most significant relationships in both their lives. Sarah often marveled at the journey her husband had taken. The man who had once defined himself entirely by his ability to stand perfectly still was now traveling the world sharing his story. The man who had rarely talked about his feelings even with her was now speaking openly to strangers about vulnerability and mental health. She was proud of him, not because he had become famous, but because he had become more fully himself. The uniform he wore at the palace was just one part of his identity now, not the entirety of it. Linda, Crawford's wife, felt similarly about her husband's transformation. The James who came home from work now was more present, more willing to talk about his day, more capable of leaving the stress at the office. The advocacy work had given him a sense of purpose that complemented his operational duties. He was not just responding to crises anymore, he was working to prevent them, to create systems that would support officers before they reached breaking points. The original viral video still existed on the internet, of course. Videos never truly disappear once they are uploaded, but the context around it had changed completely. Now, when people watched Marcus stumble backward and steady himself, they did not see a moment of humiliation. They saw the beginning of a movement, the spark that had ignited important conversations about mental health in demanding professions. The comments section, once filled with jokes and criticism, now featured testimonials from people who had been helped by the campaign Marcus and Crawford had inspired. On the second anniversary of the incident, Marcus did something he had been thinking about for months. He requested a meeting with his commanding officer and announced that he would be stepping down from his position as a Royal Guard. It was not an easy decision. The role had defined him for 7 years. His father and grandfather would forever be part of that legacy. But Marcus had come to understand that honoring their legacy did not mean following their exact path. It meant serving with the same dedication they had shown, even if that service took a different form. Marcus's new role would be full-time advocacy and education. The charity organization had offered him a position developing and delivering training programs for service organizations. He would travel, speak, develop curricula, and work directly with people who needed support. It was terrifying and exciting in equal measure. He would no longer wear the red uniform with gold buttons. He would no longer stand still for hours under the famous bearskin hat. But he would still be serving, just in a way he could never have imagined when he first took his post outside Buckingham Palace. His final day as a Royal Guard was emotional. Fellow guards who had served alongside him for years came to say goodbye. Some shared stories of times when Marcus had helped them through difficult shifts, offering quiet words of encouragement during breaks. Others thanked him for making it possible for them to be honest about their own struggles. The commanding officer presented Marcus with a framed photograph of him at his post, a reminder of the discipline and dedication he had demonstrated throughout his service. As Marcus stood at his post for the last time, tourists gathered as they always did. They took photos and videos, not knowing they were witnessing the final shift of a guard who had become known around the world. Marcus maintained his stillness, his focus, his perfect discipline, but inside his mind was filled with memories. He thought about his first day, terrified he would make a mistake. He thought about the day he was pushed, certain his career was over. He thought about all the days in between and all the unexpected turns that had led him to this moment. When his shift ended, Marcus stepped away from his post for the final time. He removed his bearskin hat, tucked it under his arm, and walked through the palace gates. A small group of people who had somehow learned it was his last day had gathered to applaud. He smiled at them, a genuine, warm smile that would have been forbidden just hours earlier while on duty. He waved, thanked them, and walked toward the future he was choosing to build. Crawford was waiting for him at their usual meeting spot, a coffee shop they had discovered during one of their early conversations. He stood when Marcus entered, and the two men embraced. No words were needed. They both understood what this day meant, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. They sat down with their coffees, and Crawford pulled out a small gift, a journal with both their names embossed on the cover. He explained that he thought they should document their journey, write down the stories and lessons they had learned, so that others could benefit even after they were gone. Marcus opened the journal to the first page, where Crawford had already written something. It was a quote they had both come to appreciate during their advocacy work. "Strength is not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to face it honestly." Below that, Crawford had written a dedication to Marcus, thanking him for his friendship, his courage, and his example. As they sat in that coffee shop, two men whose lives had collided in the most unexpected way, they reflected on everything that had changed. A viral moment that could have ended in resentment and division had instead become the foundation for friendship, purpose, and meaningful change. They had shown thousands of people that vulnerability is not weakness, that asking for help is not failure, that being human does not diminish service but rather makes it more authentic and sustainable. Marcus picked up a pen and wrote the first entry in their shared journal. He wrote about standing still and learning to move, about wearing masks and choosing authenticity, about how sometimes the moments that feel like endings are actually beginnings in disguise. He wrote about gratitude for the push that had knock,